This question is titled, what else do I need to know to be effective? Because it turns out that if you buy into the shell mindset, you're not done with just here, let me learn a little bit about the subprocess module in the Python standard library, let me learn about some of the syntax of my bash or Z shell. There's a couple of other things that you need. And when you think about that mindset, it should be obvious what else you need to know and the degree to which you need to know these. Why do we write shell scripts in the first place? We typically write them for some sort of ad hoc automation, some simple ad hoc automation. I did this thing manually, and let me just do it multiple times. That is connected to interactive use. I did this manually, cut and paste this thing into the shell script, and just do it 5 times in a row. We want to take diverse processes. Oh, this is written in Python, this is written in Ruby, this is written in C, this is written in another programming language, and you want to connect them to each other and interact with system-level state, like mount this file system, reboot this machine, start this Docker container, start the systemd process. And we want to largely just be a very simple intermediary between interactive use and the user to just automate that interactive use. As a consequence, we can generally categorize the things that we need to know to be effective at shell into 3 broad categories: mechanisms for running commands, mechanisms for connecting commands, and mechanisms for connecting commands for data flow, not for control flow. And for running commands, we can see from Python you have that subprocess module, or that fork exec pattern from any arbitrary language that has libc bindings. But if you were to accept that and ignore that and look just at the shell, mechanisms for running command, well, we see a lot of familiar things. Xargs is a mechanism for running commands. It is a mechanism by which the standard input can trigger which commands you run. So if you want to be effective at the shell, you should know how to use Xargs, because it's going to be the case that you want to run a command based on some input. You can even do this in parallel with a P flag. Well, Xargs is pretty powerful. If you want to run commands based on some data flow, namely what files exist on disk, well, you should know about find in that exec. So yeah, maybe know a little bit about find so that you can say, take these file names and run these commands for these file names, as opposed to having to type them manually yourself. If you want to go a little bit further, there are tools like new parallel. I very rarely use parallel, but parallel is kind of the same idea. Run some commands based off of some input that's given, and I find that Xargs gets me most of the way where I want to go. If you wanted to run a command on a remote host, well, your SSH isn't just about connecting for interactive use. You can say SSH and run a command remotely. There are tools for running commands on multiple hosts. Let's say you have 5 hosts. You want to go to each host and run a command. Well, there are tools like PSSH and cluster SSH. There's a bunch of these. This might be where you want to just write a very simple Python script, because if you think about it, oftentimes if you're connected to 10 hosts and you're running different commands, you want to customize slightly which command based off of something that's on that host or some configuration file. And tools like PSSH and cluster SSH make it a little bit tricky for you to do that host level customization. This is where I'd write maybe a 15-line helper script that emits the SSH commands directly or executes them using something like async SSH. So that's maybe one place where I might blur. If I needed to do complex orchestration of commands, I might use Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or Salt. But you can see there's a tiering here. At its core most, find, Xargs, probably good enough for you to be pretty good at shell. Parallel, that's kind of optional. Knowing that you can run things remotely using SSH, useful. Cluster SSH and PSSH, maybe I'll wait till I have that problem and maybe I'll write a custom shell script. If I'm writing this not against 5 hosts but 5,000 hosts, that's when I need to worry about Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or Salt. Or if I need to do really complex, check if this package is installed, and very common things related to the setup of systems, that's where I might reach for some orchestration tool. Kubernetes is also another tool of this nature if it's about running and managing containers. In the category of connecting commands for control flow, what I want to know if I want to use a shell effectively is subshells, co-processes, background jobs. Know that you can run something in a subshell and it runs as a child process under that parent process. And know how to kill all of the child processes when the parent process dies using some trap mechanism or some BRAP-like mechanism. Knowing that you can run co-processor, run things in the background, and knowing how to isolate these effectively from each other using tools like BRAP or environmental variable-based containers. Having a little bit of knowledge of workflow tools like Make, if it happens to be that your workflows tend to look kind of like what you would do to build a C program. generate this file on disk given these prerequisites using this sequence of commands. Beyond that, I would say that probably your control flow tools start to get really complex really quickly. The workflow tools get really complex really quickly, but make and simple workflow shell scripts and simple tools like background processes and co-processes get you really far, and that's more or less where I would stop unless I had an explicit need to learn, a complex workflow system. Finally, in the final category, mechanisms for connecting commands for connecting the data flow. Because the shell is dumb cables with smart connectors on either end, know the cut command. It comes up all the time. It allows you to take some space separated or IFS separated fields and grab one of the fields that you want. There's almost nothing to learn here. It'll take you 5 minutes to learn the cut command, and you'll see it pop up fairly frequently. Sed. Anytime you have line-orientated data where one line contains all the information you need to know about that one record, like, for example, oftentimes dmessage output is that way, or log output. All the data is on one line, and you want to process that line. Sed comes in very handy for doing string replacements, for doing string searches. grep goes along with sed. Sometimes people use sed for the searching. Sometimes you use grep and then you tack on a sed. But learn a little bit of the sed vocabulary. That's worthwhile. If you need to do something slightly more complicated, like you need to match certain patterns and do things programmatically on those patterns, you need to maintain some state as you go, maybe it's worth learning awk. But where I used to use awk very frequently in the old days, nowadays I actually am more likely to then reach for like a Python script to sit as an intermediate, but a really simple Python script. Even though JSON is very limiting, no JQ, because you will see it as a common thing that comes up more and more in modern shell scripts emitting JSON. And here you can see an example where I have some JSON data that I'm emitting, and I can use JQ to do some very simple extract the abc.values or extract every values under every entity. Knowing a little bit of JQ and its complex vocabulary will allow you to build simpler connectors, simpler controllers rather, because you can at least just extract with JQ all the pieces you need and only parse and interpret those pieces. And so those are what I would set upon myself if I were getting used to the shell for the first time and I needed to know what do I need to know to use this effectively. Really limit yourself to some degree of complexity that is appropriate to the kinds of problems that you have, but focus on those three categories and go as deep into those categories as the problems that you have warrant.